July 17th, 1968. Henry and Max had spent the morning at the Reno gun show. No one had a 4-bore for sale, but Henry found a Rigby 577 Nitro 3 double rifle with 300 rounds of Kynoch factory ammo on a dealer's table. He returned to the dealer's spot after he had seen all the tables at the show. "May I?" Henry asked. The dealer started to say he'd rather the gun not be handled by people who just wanted to see what an elephant gun felt like, but instead he nodded his head in assent. It had been a slow day, and this kid might be the son of some high roller just down the aisle. Henry lifted the rifle off the table and threw it to his shoulder. He turned the rifle sideways, held it up to the light, put tension on it, and tried to see between the back of the barrels and the face of the standing breech. He lowered the big gun and examined the stock for hairline cracks in the grip area. Then he pushed the top lever to the right and opened the breech. The bores were mint. Henry closed the rifle, swung the lever on the forearm iron to the side, and removed the forearm. Then he broke the gun open again and removed the barrels. He laid the buttstock on the table and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a piece of string and a plastic-handled screwdriver. The dealer was surprised but said nothing. Henry hung the barrels from the string by the foreign lug and held the screwdriver by the blade in his other hand. He rapped the barrels sharply with the plastic handle, and they made a deep, ringing sound. Henry was checking to see if the barrels had become unsoldered. Many people, even dealers, were not aware of the simple test. If the barrels had been less than completely joined together, there would have been only a loud clunk. "Tight as the day Rigby finished the gun," the dealer said unnecessarily. Henry nodded. "Got the case for it?" he asked. Max had wandered over and stood a few feet away, watching the exchange. "No, just the gun and 60 boxes of ammo." "How much for the lot?" The dealer smiled. "Son, this is an expensive rifle. The only thing bigger is A600. In nitro calibers, you mean," Henry thought silently. "I've been asking 1800, but that's because most people have something they want to trade, and I need to leave some room for maneuvering depending on what they got. If you know of a cash buyer who'll give me 14, I'll give you a $20 bill for a finder's fee." The dealer paused and reflected for a moment. "A lot of fine shotguns here this weekend. If you bring me someone who ends up trading something for it, same deal. That sound fair?" The dealer glanced at Max, smiled, and nodded to show he recognized the winner of the Calcutta. He gave Collins a look to let him know he'd be there in a moment. Max waggled his hand to show he was in no hurry. Henry looked down the table at the rows of guns. Most of them were fine English and Belgian shotguns. "Do you have any other double rifles that aren't laid out here?" "Got A465 Holland back at the shop that I'm holding for a customer, but I haven't seen any cash yet. That's the only one that isn't here," he answered quickly. The dealer assumed Henry was scouting for someone who didn't want the dealers to know he was around. Henry nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his roll of cash, which was now considerably thicker since he had changed some of the large bills for hundreds, 50s and 20s. He handed the man 1,000, 300s, and 420s. "That do it? 1,400 less the finder's fee?" The dealer was startled, but he recovered quickly. He had seen stranger things than this. "Cash makes no enemies," the dealer replied as he took the money. "So let's be friends." Max Collins walked over to his nephew. "Let me help you carry the ammo out to the car." The dealer looked startled. "This your son, Mr. Collins? I didn't know you were in the market for a double rifle." "My sister's son, Henry Bowman," Max corrected. "And the rifle's his. He had to settle for something a little smaller than what he wanted, at least for now." Henry handed the man a piece of paper. "Here's my name and address. I'm looking for a full-weight 4-bore, at least 22 pounds, barrels fully rifled, in good shape. Please drop me a card if you run across one." Henry had handed out several such notes that morning. The dealer looked at the piece of paper. It had Henry's name and address printed on it, as well as a description of the rifle he wanted. "Haven't seen one of those in years, but I'll put this in my file. Here, let me help you with all this ammo," he said quickly, as Henry picked up his new rifle. Henry and the dealer were both smiling as they walked out to Max's Impala. "Mr. Cumberland, you only know me through the mail. I'm Henry Bowman. With the Solothurn you reload for from St. Louis. Sure, great to have you out here." The slender man with slightly thinning hair shook Henry's hand. "This is my Uncle Max and some of his friends from the pigeon shoot. Uncle Max, this is Dangerous Dave. Pleased to meet you, sir, Cumberland said, extending his hand to the big man. Your nephew apparently shoots his solithern as much as we do out here. He's bought quite a lot of components from us in the last year or so. Hey, Dave. Doyle, you bring these folks out here today? Great. He swept his arm around, indicating the people and cannons assembled out in the Nevada desert. Welcome to the irregularly held unofficial meeting of the Benevolent Artillery Loaders and Loafers Society. Balls, as it were. We have a wide array of historic ordnance on display for your perusal and entertainment. He indicated a man of indeterminate age, 30 yards distant tinkering, with a beautifully polished brass-jacketed gun mounted on a tripod. In this corner we have Dolph Goldsmith, our resident Maxim authority, toiling over an 1897 Argentine model he'll be warming up shortly. To his left is Ed Anthony, here from North Carolina. Ed is our visiting mortar expert, and he'll be demonstrating his skill by dropping some practice rounds into a 55-gallon drum from 200 yards away. Cumberland continued his Master of Ceremonies act for the newcomers. To your right is our bar division. They'll be shooting tracers at some long-range targets out a quarter mile or so. Ditching dynamite taped onto poles stuck in the ground makes a satisfying boom. Behind that are our Hotchkiss enthusiasts. Check out the 5-barrel 37mm revolving cannon when you get a chance. Made in 1895, and it's a beauty. All around you can see a wide array of larger ordnance, which we'll be shooting in an hour or so. He noticed that Henry had gravitated to a long, bipod-mounted weapon about the size of his solithern. It was a Finnish Lahti 20mm, which Henry knew fired the same cartridge as his gun. The boy bent over and was examining the scope mount on the big anti-tank rifle. Maynard Bueller prides himself on making a mount for anything the customer has. He knocked that one out for my Lahti. I've been experimenting with individually weighed bullets in segregated cases. It's a tack driver. Henry nodded. The Lahti, while not quite as finely finished as the solithern, was gas-operated instead of recoil-operated, and did not have a quick-change barrel like the Swiss gun. In theory, its solid breech design should give it an advantage in accuracy, but in issue form the Lahti was equipped with coarse metallic sights, while the solithern had fine optics. Cumberland's scoped gun would be interesting to shoot at long range. Now here's the one I think you should add to your collection, Henry, Dave said, pointing to a small breech-loading cannon on a wheeled mount. 50mm Krupp Model 1902 mountain cannon disassembles in 5 minutes, designed to be transported on 4 horses or 1 elephant. The factory made 50 of them for Siam in that year, and I brought 35 of them into the U.S. in 1961. Still got a few left after 7 years. Here's the round. Make the brass out of shortened 40mm Bofors cases. He handed Henry a stubby cartridge with a diameter of about 2 inches. It weighed about 5 pounds. Make yourselves at home, gentlemen, Cumberland suggested. I've still got a few things to take care of before we start shooting. He excused himself and went over to one of the larger field pieces. This is great, Henry said with feeling. The men around him laughed, but they knew exactly how he felt. July 22nd, 1968. Henry Bowman had not been back in St. Louis for 15 minutes before he went to his room and started digging through the pile of back issues of gun magazines which were stacked in the corner. After several minutes of riffling through several of the periodicals, he found the ads he was looking for. Serviceable very easily, just like Doyle Patterson's Monitor had been. No use saving money, Henry decided. He got out his pen and started to check off his next purchases. There were quite a lot of them. August 2nd, 1968. What kind of sodas you got in here? Henry Bowman asked as he climbed halfway over the back of the front seat to get at the ice chest in the rear of the 1964 Olds F-85. Little bit of everything, have a look, and drag out a Coke for me, suggested David Webb without taking his eyes off the road. Henry dug a Coca-Cola and a Whistle Orange soda out from under the ice. He opened 2 slits in the top of each with the can opener blade of the Swiss Army knife he had earned every day for the last 9 years, and handed the cola to the older boy. Then he settled back down in the passenger seat and unfolded the map. Where should we put in? South of Pershing, couple miles, David suggested after a moment's thought. Shouldn't be too many other people around, not this weekend at least. Most everybody will be on the Merrimack Gasconade's not as easy to get to. Henry turned sideways and leaned against the door, sipping his orange soda. He didn't really care where they started. or where they ended up for that matter. He and David were going to park the car, take the 17-foot Grumman canoe off the roof, load their camping gear in it, and paddle down the Gasconade River until they either got bored or ran out of time. They weren't apt to run out of river. It wound southwest for about 150 miles. David Webb was 18, which made him nearly 3 years older than Henry, and had finished high school 2 months ago. He intended to start technical school in less than 3 weeks, unaware that he would be getting his draft notice 2 days before the first day of classes. No one in David Webb's family had ever had any education beyond that offered by rural public high schools, and David's imminent entry into Rankin Tech was regarded by his parents in the same way that the Bowman or Collins family would view a Phi Beta Kappa key. David's father owned a welding shop in Jefferson County, where he made a decent living repairing the farm equipment that invariably broke when stressed beyond its design limits by owners bent on getting their harvesting done in the shortest possible amount of time. Despite the age difference and their vastly different socioeconomic backgrounds, the two young men were good friends. They had met the previous summer. Henry's skill with guns impressed the older boy, as did his quick, analytical mind. Henry, who had grown up helping his father with woodworking projects, appreciated David's mechanical skills. Unlike other people who were faced with the reality of a younger companion who was both smarter and of higher social class, David Webb harbored no hostility whatsoever towards Henry Bowman. This was because the older boy himself had a talent unusual in an 18-year-old, in which Henry greatly admired the country boy with the lopsided grin and the cut-rate education had thick calluses on both his hands, and they weren't there from farm labor. David Webb drove sprint cars, and he was the youngest driver in a 4-state region to ever take the checkered flag while piloting one of the twitchy, violent, overpowered dirt track machines. Henry and David had met by chance. Walter Bowman had taken his son to one of the local races the year before, after Walter's cancer had been diagnosed. Henry had suggested they try to track down Anvil Jenkins by asking around at Midwestern racetracks. The Bowmans met a few old-timers who remembered Jenkins from pre-war racing days, but they never located the man himself. No one had seen him on the racing circuit after the war had ended. The Bowmans did meet David Webb, however, who was something of a racetrack curiosity at age 17, and the two young men had hit it off. David lived only 4 miles from the Collins and Bowman summer property, and the two boys often spent weekends together when David wasn't racing or putting in his hours at the welding shop. Now the pair were headed for a 3-day canoe trip in southern Missouri. Henry relaxed and sipped his soda while David piloted the Olds Coupe West on Highway 100, his eyes constantly scanning the road ahead and glancing at the rearview mirror in case anyone were about to overtake them. With a canoe on the roof rack, which David and his father had welded together out of chrome moly tubing, the young man held the car to 75 miles per hour. The 327 Chevrolet engine, built out of a sprint car short block and installed using 1966 Chevelle motor mounts, loafed along at 2,600 revolutions per minute. "What we really need on this trip is a couple of girls," David said with a grin. "They wouldn't fit in the canoe. If we had 2 canoes, it would work. A couple of sisters. Older one about 17 or 18 for me and the younger one for you. One with freckles and real thick glasses, with a whole bunch of books to read, really make your heart do a backflip. Someone just your age." "How old are you now anyway, Einstein?" David demanded. 12, 13? Henry couldn't help the grin that surfaced at David's good-natured ribbing. "Yeah, and by the time we got back home, your girl would have the wedding invitations all printed and the baby clothes bought," he shot back. "You and she could make it a triple." Henry was alluding to the fact that each of David's 2 older brothers had had to get married. "Not me, boy. Storks bring babies. I like the birds that keep babies away," David said, playing for the standard response. "Swallows," they said simultaneously, and the two started laughing in earnest. With the windows rolled down and his arm resting on the top of the door, Henry began to sing one of the unusual songs from his seemingly endless repertoire of obscure works. This one was to the tune of Johnny Horton's The Battle of New Orleans, and told the tale of boys at summer camp hoping to find girls on the other side of the lake. "They teach you that song at that school you go to?" his friend asked facetiously when Henry had finished singing. Although Crystal City High did not have choir practice like the private school in St. Louis County that Henry attended, David Webb knew that no prep school in the nation instructed its charges in decade-old tunes recorded by the musical duo Homer and Jethro. Sure did. Your school could have a glee club and learn great songs too, if they could just get you and your classmates through the course where you learn to eat with knives and forks. Don't go making fun of the Barrows family again. Jay Barrows, who had been in the 3rd grade when David Webb was in kindergarten, had ended up in David's graduating class. After being held back 3 times in grade school and junior high, he still could not quite read whole sentences. Why not? Henry asked. Is it Be Kind to Animals Week? David started laughing in spite of himself. His mixed-breed dog often exhibited more intelligence than his hapless schoolmate. I'd like to show you how this thing runs since Jonesy milled the heads, David said, changing the subject, but I'm afraid the canoe will blow off. Poor workmanship and shoddy welding on the home-built rack, I suppose. The rack's okay. It's the screws holding it to the roof I'm worried about, asshole. Ah, show me when we get back home. We got lots of time, Henry said expansively. David Webb nodded his agreement, took a swig of his Coke, and held the Chevy-engined Oldsmobile at an indicated 75. Hey, nice job, Einstein. Last time we did this, you about dropped your end. You must be getting stronger. Next thing you know, you'll be old enough to have a girlfriend. Just remind me to find one who spends less on makeup than I do on ammo, Henry said with an effort as he muscled the Grumman towards the water. David set his end of the aluminum canoe down at the edge of the riverbank. You talking about Mona? Yeah, I guess she did paint it on a little thick. His face brightened. But hey, it was a sight better looking than what was underneath. Both boys started laughing at that. Their tent, one-burner Coleman stove, utensils, fuel, and food were wrapped in plastic and combat packed into a single folded duffel bag, along with an empty gallon jug for flotation in case the pack went overboard. The duffel and the cooler of sodas went aft of the canoe's center thwart. The sleeping bags went behind them. Henry wore a Smith & Wesson Model 29 with 83/8 barrel in an angled Bolin cross-draw holster in front of his left hip. He lifted his GI 50 caliber ammo can and placed it just behind the bow seat. The steel can was half full of 44 Magnum ammo Henry had loaded the week before. He had used once-fired Remington cases and 173 grain 3-4 jacketed bullets Alan Kane had made in Lakeville Arms swaging dies. A braided steel cable with a spring clip was swaged to the wire handle at one end of the can. Henry clipped it to the seat strut. The two boys threw their knee cushions in front of their respective seats, and David went back to move the Oldsmobile. Henry watched as his friend stowed the car in a clump of trees, lifted the hood, and put the rotor from the distributor in his jeans. David locked the car and trotted back to the canoe. David's car had never been bothered before when they'd left it for a few days, but he wanted to be safe just in case. Okay, hotshot, think you can hit one of those? Henry turned and saw David Webb pointing to some crows that were flying off to their right. They looked to be well over 100 yards distant, to Henry Bowman's practiced eye. He shook his head. Too far. For a moving target, anyway. He laid his paddle behind him in the canoe, withdrew the long-barreled revolver from its holster, and hooked his finger under the steel headband he wore which had earplugs attached to each side. Without taking his eyes off the crows, he flexed the spring steel and guided first one plug, then the other, into his ears. He was already wearing his yellow-tinted shooting glasses. Maybe one of them will land in a tree, he said, ready to take aim. He had not fired his revolver yet that day, and it was well past noon. David and Henry drifted in the canoe, watching the blackbirds. As the crow flies, the euphemism for a straight path between 2 points on the map is a misapplied phrase. A crow's flight is anything but straight, and Henry Bowman knew it. As he had suspected might happen, 2 of the birds in the group abruptly changed course. One of them flew on an angle towards them. Henry extended his arms, and as he cocked the hammer, he drew the big revolver into the two-handed, braced position he favored for longer shots when a rest was unavailable. His right arm was straight, his left one bent at the elbow with the left shoulder forward. His left elbow was locked into his left side, and his left hand pushed firmly on the knuckles of his right. An isosceles triangle was formed from his left forearm, his torso, and his entire right arm. This technique would come to be called the Weaver stance, after a shooter in the 1970s who would popularize it in competition. Ears, Stroker, Henry said softly. The crow was about to reach the point in its flight where it would be as close to the canoe as it was going to get. A wooded hillside loomed on the other side of the river, so Henry had a safe backstop for the shot. He was calculating his lead as his finger applied increasing pressure to the trigger. 50 or 60 yards out, time of flight a tenth of a second. Birds flying maybe 15 miles per hour, call it 23 feet per second, lead. At a little over 2 feet when it hits the perpendicular point, hold. A couple inches low since I'm sighted in at 100, front. Sight. The trigger broke when the pressure exerted by Henry's right finger reached 2¼ pounds, and the 50-ounce BLD steel revolver rose upward sharply in recoil. As the muzzle blast echoed off the hillsides, David Webb's jaw dropped involuntarily as he watched the distant crow literally explode in flight. "Holy shit!" he exclaimed, removing his fingers from his ears and staring at the feathers fluttering in the sky. Henry had replaced the Smith in its holster and was twisted around in the drifting canoe, a smug smile on his face. "That was a lucky shot," Webb said accusingly. Henry shrugged. "You practice a whole lot. Seems like lucky things happen pretty often. Like that last race you won," he added pointedly. "That gun always do that to birds?" David asked, nodding towards where the crow had been. Henry shook his head. "Most of the time I shoot cast bullets. You know, ones made out of melted down tire weights and quenched in a bucket of water." Webb nodded. His friend was always scrounging wheel weights from the tire shops in Jefferson County. "They don't deform at all unless you hit a rock or something." He gestured out to where the feathers were drifting through the air. "That was a 3/4 jacket jugular, 173 grain hollow point designed by Jim. Harvey, before he shot himself, made to blow up groundhogs at 50 yards, but Alan Kane says they seem to shoot as well at long range as the big 270 grainers. Longton up at Smith tightened the barrel cylinder gap down to 2/1000ths on this gun for me. Gives me an extra 100 or so feet per second. Gun ties up if it gets real hot, but for slow fire at long range, it's great. I loaded up 1,000 of the 17.3s with a ball powder load that's running damn near 1,900 feet per second, which was why that crow exploded. I got my sights dead on at 100 yards. Tomorrow I want to do some 500-yard practice when we break for lunch." "I'd like to see that." "Great!" Henry exclaimed. "You can run across the valley and check my targets." David Webb splashed him with his canoe paddle. "Ready to put in for the night?" David asked from the stern seat of the canoe. Neither boy wore a watch, but from the fading light, it was obviously close to 9 o'clock. "Suits me." Within 20 minutes, David and Henry had banked the canoe, removed their gear from it, pitched Henry's mountaineering tent, unfurled their sleeping bags, started a small campfire, and set an open can of beef stew on the Coleman camp stove. The stove was for cooking. The fire was because both boys liked campfires. "If we had a couple of girls with us, we'd be listening to 'em complain about the skeeters, and we probably wouldn't have the tent up or the fire built," David said, in a voice that hinted that he felt that still might be a pretty small price to pay. "If we had a couple of girls here, you'd have probably got your dick caught in your zipper, fell out of the canoe, and drowned 5 hours ago," Henry suggested, unconsciously lapsing into the speech patterns of his older friend. "I'd have died happy," David said, laughing. He then began to describe in animated detail the things he would like to do with Shelley Moore, who was one of the Crystal City High School cheerleaders. Henry had heard it all before, except the part about the molasses. "Come on, admit it, Einstein," David said finally. "You had the choice right now between going out shooting with that big pistol of yours tomorrow or curling up with one of them chicks in the gym class for the whole afternoon. You wouldn't study on it too damn long, now would you?" Henry laughed and tossed a stick into the campfire. "Okay, Stroker," Henry said, using the common racer's nickname, which took on an entirely different meaning under the present circumstances. "I admit it, you're right. What I'd like most of all is for us to come across some cute little blonde tomorrow, without any clothes on, who's been waiting all day for me to show up and dazzle her with my talent. That's what I really wish would happen on this trip. You satisfied?" The two boys both broke out laughing. Henry Bowman had never been one to wish out loud for things. The last time had been when he was 7 years old and had told his father he wished one of his classmates would move away. The classmate was a good friend with whom Henry had had an argument. It would not be until the next day of the canoe trip that Henry Bowman would recall what his late father had said to him at the time. "Better watch what you wish for, son. Sometimes wishes come true." August 3rd, 1968. "You ready for lunch yet?" David Webb asked as the sun neared its zenith in the sky. Henry stopped paddling and turned around. "Not exactly," Henry said, "but this looks like maybe a good spot coming up to try out these loads at long range." He gestured off to their right. "Let's put in up there and I'll take a walk up that valley, see if I can find a good spot up on a hill with some rocks out 400 or 500 yards. David gave a few strong J-strokes and used his paddle as a rudder to steer the canoe over towards the bank. The older boy beached the canoe and Henry stepped out of the bow, pulling the craft up on the dirt bank of the river. David looked to make sure he wasn't about to put his foot on any glass or nails and stepped barefoot into the shallow water. "I keep telling you you're crazy to tramp around all the time without any shoes on," Henry said, watching his friend. He himself wore a pair of Vietnam combat boots which had a hinged piece of aluminum built into the sole. You could step on a 10-penny nail sticking straight up out of a piece of plywood without discomfort. The boots had been specifically designed to negate the effects of the foot breakers the North Vietnamese were so fond of creating, a single round of rifle ammunition sitting on the point of a nail inside a short length of bamboo, with one half of the bullet exposed out the top, all firmly set into the ground in any area where American GIs were likely to walk. When the soldier stepped on the nose of the bullet, the primer detonated and the cartridge exploded. A cartridge outside a rifle chamber, when ignited, acts like a big firecracker. The projectile has no more energy than a piece of gravel lying next to a silver salute. Henry had demonstrated this fact to a horrified David Webb on a previous trip by tossing a live round of .44 Magnum ammunition into the campfire and calmly waiting for it to explode. In a VC footbreaker, the bamboo tube, though destroyed in the process, offers some containment of the explosion. This is sufficient to channel the explosive force and impart enough velocity to the bullet to break a man's foot. Word had come back to the States of what was happening, and bootmakers with government contracts had quickly responded. Henry owned several pairs, all bought through his ammunition suppliers. "You've just got tender feet," David said in reply to his young friend's comment. Henry shrugged. David's statement was true. "How long you gonna be?" he asked Henry, changing the subject. "Depends on if I find a good spot to shoot from. Want to come along? I'll teach you to hit stuff the size of a 5-gallon bucket 300 or 400 yards away." "Yeah, but you go on ahead. I gotta get some shoes on." "Want me to help you stow the canoe?" "Nah, I got that. Go on ahead and scout out a good spot. I'll catch up in a few minutes." Henry nodded. David was 5 inches taller with correspondingly longer legs and was considerably faster hiking through the woods than was Henry. The younger boy stared up at the wooded hills trying to decide where the best spot was apt to be. Finally, he elected to break a trail in a different direction from the most inviting path. "I'm going to head up this way," he said. "Looks like a lot less traffic has been there. Better chance of no people being around if we find a good spot. I'll leave a few blazes for you so you won't get lost." David Webb grinned his understanding as Henry turned and headed off towards one of the wooded slopes. Henry had been walking for the better part of an hour, but the hill had not, as he had hoped, led to a high spot with a good view of distant rock outcroppings. So far, the terrain had been nothing but gently rolling hills, and all he had managed to discover was a small knoll that overlooked more woods. There was absolutely nowhere to do any long-range shooting, at least not so far. Henry Bowman's spirits were undampened, however. He liked walking out in the woods. He liked being on a canoe trip with David Webb. He knew by the time they stashed the canoe for the final time and walked to the nearest road to hitchhike back to get the car, he would be out of ammo regardless of whether or not he ever found a place to shoot 600 yards. The weather was slightly less hot and humid than usual for Missouri in August, and heat did not bother the 15-year-old the way it did people 2 or 3 times his. Age! All in all, Henry Bowman was having a very good time just as things were. He stopped and sat down on an inviting-looking log, unslung the gas mask pouch from his shoulder, and stretched. He looked back the way he had come. There was as yet no sign of his friend. Must be getting a little faster, he thought with a smile. Henry had grown 4 inches in the past year and now stood almost 5'7". He reached into his ammo bag and pulled out a piece of beef jerky sealed in plastic and a can of 7-Up. His Swiss Army knife provided the opener for the beverage, and Henry commenced the serious business of consuming his snack. After he had drained the last of his soda and had started occupying himself by calculating drop curves in his head, Henry decided to continue on farther. No use making life too easy on old Stroker, he thought with a smile, and stood up, donning his ammo pack as he did so. Before continuing his hike, he opened his big case knife and thoughtfully cut a large slash across the log on which he had been sitting. Then he set off again at a brisk walk. Henry was several miles from the spot on the river where they had stowed the canoe, and it was looking less and less likely that he was going to find a suitable spot for long-range revolver practice. Rocks and loose dirt were required at the receiving end of such shooting to allow the shooter to be able to spot his shots with the naked eye and correct his hold accordingly. So far, all Henry had seen was acres and acres of trees with an occasional open patch of grass. Bag it? Henry asked himself. Hell, might as well go on a little while yet. Henry would later reflect on that innocuous choice and imagine how his life might have been different if instead he had decided, time to head back. Henry Bowman was always very conscientious about protecting his ears while shooting, which was why he heard the faint noise. He cocked his head, straining to hear. There was a faint, high-pitched keening noise carried towards him by the same summer wind that rustled the leaves on the trees, which then drowned it out. Henry frowned and shook his head. Real high-pitched. Scream, I think. Wounded rabbit, maybe he dead to himself, realizing that he had no idea what wounded rabbits sounded like, if indeed they made any ice at all. The young boy drew the big revolver out of the bowline rig and started carefully walking through the woods. As Henry Bowman drew closer to where he believed the noise had originated, he began to make out the sound of a man's voice. He could not grasp the individual words, but the tone was that of someone giving brief orders. In another 50 yards he could tell that there was more than one man. The keening noise continued. Deer poachers? He thought reflexively, then instantly rejected the idea. He didn't think wounded deer made anything like the noise he was now hearing. Henry stopped and turned back towards where he had come from, trying to hear if David Webb was approaching in the distance. Suddenly there was a bark of coarse laughter, and the keening noise intensified and became more frantic sounding. Henry didn't have a clue as to what was going on, but he was beginning to get a very bad feeling about it. He continued on slowly through the foliage. Further back, you two, Lowell Charles L.C., Bivens commanded his brother and the one helping him as he reached under his sagging belly to stroke himself. Get her all the way open. Put your shoulders into it. She can't weigh much more'n half of either one of you. Trent Bivens and Gary Court, both drained from their exertions of the previous 20 minutes, did as Trent's older brother demanded. Cammy Lynn tried to scream out in agony, but her mouth had been stuffed with a dirty shop towel, and her entire head below her nose, as well as most of her neck, was bound with over a dozen wraps of black electrician's tape. Only a muffled noise escaped from her mucus-clogged nose. It sounded anything but human. Henry Bowman stopped and turned his head, frowning. What on earth could have made that sound? He glanced back at his trail, then continued on towards the source of the noise. The girl was nude, on her back on top of a fallen oak tree. Baling wire bound her wrists underneath the log and bit into the flesh above her hip bones where it had been tightened around the dead oak. A third length of wire was wrapped twice around the log and Cammy Lynn's neck, rendering her head virtually immobile. This one was looser than the other twists of wire, or else the girl would not have still been alive. The two younger men, each holding one of the girl's ankles, had her legs bent back as far as they could. They had her feet up above her head, and had also pulled them away from each other until her ankles were almost 4 feet apart. Cammy Lynn, like most girls in junior high school, was very limber, but the strength of the young men and the leverage they possessed tore some of her ligaments and tendons. The baling wire around her abdomen split the skin and disappeared, leaving a bright red valley of oozing blood. Elsie Bivens watched the wire bury itself in the girl's pale flesh and let out a short bark of laughter. He was fully erect, and now he thrust deeply into Cammy Lynn's body. He stared into the terror-filled eyes of his victim and let his pleasure build towards a climax. Then he stopped for a moment, pulled a knife out of his overalls, and resumed his efforts. There's that laugh again, Henry Bowman said to himself. I'm getting close. He proceeded on more cautiously towards the sound. The oak log was angled towards the direction from which Henry was approaching, with the girl's head nearest him. L.C., who stood straddling the log as he thrust in and out of the girl, directly faced the area of the woods that Henry was now carefully negotiating. Nat Bivens was the only one of the attackers with nothing to do. He darted back and forth to either side of the victim, hopping over the log and watching his cousin's efforts with utter fascination. Nat was the youngest of the four males. He was almost 17, but because of his slight build and thick glasses, looked younger. That, coupled with the fact that he had yet to pass the written portion of the Missouri driving test and thus did not have a driver's license, accounted for his older cousin's treatment of him. It was Nat who had been assigned the task of keeping track of Cammy Lynn's whereabouts so that his cousins and Gary Court could snatch her at the proper moment. "Remember, I get a turn," Nat whined. He had the very reasonable fear that his older cousin was going to change his mind and refuse to let him participate in the rape. It would not be the first time Elsie had excluded him from their activities. "I ain't done yet," the oldest Bivens panted. He had let his brother and their friend take their turns at the girl first. Elsie had feigned magnanimity with this gesture, but his real motive had been twofold. First, he knew the girl would be dry, and that did not appeal to him. Secondly, he intended to kill her as he reached his climax, to heighten his own pleasure. He had no intention of letting Nat in on their fun, but Trent and Gary had certainly deserved a share. Bivens rocked back and forth, growing continually harder. He liked the slippery feeling that the two other men had left for him, and he realized he was getting close. He held the knife up in front of his face, giving Cammy Lynn a good look at it, and taking great pleasure in the terror he saw in her eyes. Henry Bowman finally caught a glimpse of blue denim 40 yards ahead of him. He quickly moved to put a large walnut tree between himself and the strangers he knew were up ahead, and then he did something that might have surprised a casual observer. He hooked his left index finger inside the steel band and positioned the left earplug in his left ear. Elsie Bivens slowly waved the knife in front of the girl's face as he continued to thrust in and out of her. The two other men had involuntarily relaxed their pressure on her legs. They were waiting to see what Elsie was going to do. "Let's see if this'll make her twitch a little bit," Bivens said, and drew the entire length of the knife blade vertically across Cammy Lynn's left nipple, slicing it in half. The girl's throat was raw, she was choking on the rag, and she was about to drown in her own mucus, but the pain of this latest act was indescribable, and she twisted with all her strength, causing the wire to bite more deeply into both her abdomen and her throat. An inhuman noise ushered from her nasal passages. "What the hell?" Henry immediately stepped, slightly to the right, and ducked his head to get a better look rough a gap in the foliage. At first, Henry did not understand what he was seeing. There was a cluster of 3 men and 1 boy, and it appeared that the men were engaged in trying to move a fallen log, while the young boy stood with his back to Henry. Henry noticed a 12-gauge pump gun of uncertain make lying against the end of the log. What on earth is making that noise? Henry wondered. Elsie Bivens felt the beginnings of his orgasm and let out a guttural sound of satisfaction. He drew back his hand and prepared to thrust the knife's entire 5-blade into Cammy Lynn's abdomen. "Wait, Elsie," Nat Bivens yelled as he ran around Gary Court and grabbed his cousin's arm, wanting him to delay the damage until after he had a chance to use the girl. "I ain't had my turn yet." Bivens dropped the knife, twisted his arm out of Nat's clumsy grasp, and backhanded his cousin on the side of head, sending the boy's glasses flying. Nat stumbled and fell to his knees behind the older man. When Nat Bivens had run to his older cousin's side and had then been knocked away, Henry Bowman had seen exactly what was going on. He instinctively slid to the left to put more of his body behind the walnut tree and swung his big Smith & Wesson up into the braced position, cocking it in the process. The first emotion that came into Henry Bowman's mind was gin clear, kill all 4 of them. Then he saw the big one shake his head as if to clear it. Reason took over once more, and Henry silently pleaded, "Stop what you were doing. Go, leave the girl, just go." Henry had his front sight trained on Elsie Bivens' sternum, but his eyes darted around the area, looking for other men in addition to the 4 he saw. He spotted no other people, but he did see an H&R single-barrel shotgun leaning against a tree in between himself and the rapist, in addition to the 12-gauge pump he had noticed before. Elsie Bivens glanced with disgust at his cousin, who was feeling around on the ground trying to find his glasses, then turned his attention back to the girl and smiled. "Oh shit," thought Henry. Elsie bent over, picked up the knife, and raised it in an overhand grip, as if it were an ice pick. "Freeze!" Henry Bowman yelled at the top of his lungs. L.C. Bivens, Trent Bivens, and Gary Court had not noticed the soft click of Henry Bowman's revolver being cocked moments before, but they would have had to been deaf not to have heard his shouted command. L.C. jerked his head up from where he was selecting the spot to sink the knife, and Trent and Gary whirled around. All three of them immediately spotted Henry. "Get him," the oldest Bivens commanded as he clenched his teeth and raised the knife again, preparing to drive it home. Trent and Gary were used to following L.C. Bivens's orders, and they did not elect to defy him this time. Both men ran for their guns. Trent Bivens ran towards the sweet gum tree, where he had leaned his shotgun before raping Cammy Lynn. The old Harrington and Richardson single barrel was 10 feet away from him, roughly in the direction of the tree behind which Henry Bowman stood. Gary Court took 2 quick steps towards the J.C. Higgins he had left lying against the log. Henry saw Elsie's arm muscles tense and knew the man was about to kill the girl. He relentlessly increased the pressure of his right index finger and ignored the fact that Trent Bivens was about to cross his line of fire. Front sight, he grimly reminded himself. There was a natural tendency for shooters to focus on the target instead of the sights at the moment of litoff, especially when under pressure. L.C. Bivens was blurred slightly in Henry Bowman's vision. The 24-karat gold insert in the front sight blade which covered Bivens' heart, however, was sharp enough for Henry to see the tiny hammer marks on it, made when it had been installed by Fran Longton in S&W's Springfield, Massachusetts service facility a year earlier. The big revolver thundered, and the 173-grain hollow point bullet made by Alan Kane in Lakeville Arms Swaging Dies exited the 83/8 barrel at 1,870 feet per second. The bullet passed less than 10 inches from Trent Bivens' left ear and struck L.C. Bivens in almost the exact center of his sternum. The combined effect of the muzzle blast 50 feet in front of him and the painful crack of a supersonic projectile passing less than a foot from his ear was very disorienting to Trent Bivens, and he winced and stumbled, but kept running for his shotgun. The effect the bullet had on Trent's cousin L.C. was more impressive. Alan Kane had used a long hollow point punch in the swaging die when he had made the slugs, which made a large cavity in the nose of the bullet that extended down almost to its base. This concentrated the projectile's mass towards its outer circumference, nearer to the actual bearing surface, and was one of the reasons that the slugs had shot so accurately for the Indiana experimenter. The design had the secondary effect of destroying much of the structural integrity of the bullet. Over the years, ammunition manufacturers would regularly use these same construction techniques in vain attempts to increase the incapacitating power of low-powered, low-velocity sidearm ammunition. The results were almost always disappointing. Cartridges such as the 25 and 32 ACP usually had too little velocity to make even the most fragile bullet break up, and if the slow-moving slugs did fragment, penetration was so slight that an attacker's leather coat would sometimes stop the bullet entirely. Frangible bullets were a different story in a high-intensity cartridge like the .44 Magnum, and in Henry's long-barreled gun with its tight cylinder gap and full-pressure handloads, doubly so. When the Lakeville Arms 173-grain jugular hollow point hit L.C. Bivens, it truly lived up to the moniker its late designer had given it. As the front half of the projectile turned itself into microscopic fragments of lead and copper, it released over 1,200 foot-pounds of kinetic energy inside the chest cavity of the rapist and murderer. Bivens' chest cavity literally exploded, and the homogenized contents of his upper torso followed the path of least resistance, just as the laws of physics dictated. In L.C.'s case, the weak point was a gash in his back made by a piece of his spine which the impact had turned into a secondary missile. Nat Bivens, the feckless younger cousin who had been backhanded by L.C. only moments before, had just crawled to a spot directly behind L.C. when Henry fired his first shot. Nat's back was sprayed with a mixture of blood, heart tissue, and fragments of both bone and metal just before the 230-pound corpse of his late cousin landed on top of him. In a move he had practiced some 40,000 times, Henry Bowman glanced at his second target and hauled the gun down out of recoil. While he did this, he pulled the Smith's trigger double action until the tip of his trigger finger touched the revolver's frame behind and to the left of the trigger. This was far enough to make the cylinder advance to the next chamber and lock in place, but not far enough to make the gun fire. 30 years earlier, Ed McGivern had called this technique the two-stage braked trigger pull. 20 years in the future, shooters would call it trigger cocking. As Henry finished trigger cocking the revolver, he focused his master eye on the gold insert of the front sight. Trent Bivens, with a searing pain in his right ear, tried to get his shotgun into action from its position leaning against the tree. At the instant the front sight of Henry's gun crossed the line of Trent's scalp, Henry Bowman gave the trigger the additional pressure needed, and his second shot hit the younger Bivens brother just to the right of the tip of his nose. The back of Trent's skull split open under the tremendous hydraulic pressure, and over one half of his brain matter was blown out the jagged opening. Henry Bowman did not see the effect of this shot, for he was already backpedaling and rotating his whole body, maintaining the braced position of his arms, torso, and neck, and trigger cocking the Model 29 again as he brought it to bear on the figure of Gary Court. Court had enjoyed his session with the young girl, and had been doing his best to dislocate her hip from its socket, while Elsie was taking his turn. He was out of breath from these exertions, and this new development had appeared out of nowhere. Every part of Gary Court's brain was being bombarded with stimuli, and he acted instinctively. In Court's case, this meant grabbing the shotgun with his right hand and sliding his right forefinger inside the trigger guard at the same time. Sticking his finger into the trigger guard before he had complete control of the weapon was not the only bad habit Gary Court had when it came to gun handling. He also was rather cavalier about using his gun's safety, and it was disengaged at the moment. As Court's hand instinctively tightened around the weapon, his finger pulled the trigger, and 1.25 ounces of No. 6 birdshot shredded leaves 10 yards above and to the right of where Henry Bowman stood. As a flustered Gary Court pumped the slide of his shotgun, Henry Bowman put the gold bead on Court's center of mass and exerted a little more pressure on the trigger. He was aiming for the heart, and he got it. Court fell as if every bone in his body had suddenly turned to liquid. He was dead before his knee struck the spot where his shotgun had been resting. From the moment Henry had yelled until the time that Gary Court's body collapsed in the grass was less than 4 seconds. Henry Bowman saw Nat Bivens frantically trying to extricate himself from underneath his dead cousin, and he made a snap decision. He sprinted to the boy, put a knee onto his back, and shoved the muzzle of the Smith & Wesson into the base of his skull. Henry swept the area with his eyes, looking for signs of any other people, especially hostile ones. Seeing none, he clenched his teeth and looked at the girl. He was relieved to see that she was still alive. Her eyes stared at the sky, for she was in shock. Then a strong feeling of revulsion washed through Henry when he saw what the man had done to her chest. He looked at the trembling form of Nat Bivens, saw the boy's glasses 6 feet away in the grass, and started to formulate a plan. "Who were they?" Henry demanded, making sure the boy could not see him out of the corner of his eye. "Him, that's my cousin Elsie," Nat snuffled, pointing towards the corpse a few feet away. "Did Trent and Gary get away? They're dead. Who's the girl?" "Nat Bivens," voice carried surprising hatred. "That's Cammy Lynn. Little bitch," he added. It was clear that he was starting to blame her for his current predicament. "Didn't even get my turn," he muttered. Henry inhaled slowly, thinking about this last comment, and trying to appear calm. "Damn all Elsie," Nat said with feeling. "Always keeping me out of everything, and I was teach one what got her here for him." "Oh, yeah. I followed her last 2-3 days. Told him right where to get her," he said proudly. "Little bitch was going to tell on us." "Tell on you?" At this question, Nat Bivens closed his mouth defiantly, and Henry stabbed the muzzle into his neck as a reminder. "About the business. Car parts." "What kind of car parts?" Henry demanded. "Any kind you need," Nat said with what might have been a touch of pride. "Elsie can get. Week, sometimes 2, and a cheap price ain't but half what the dealers get." He rushed on, explaining himself. "She was talking about it to one of the people she babysits for. Little boy's big brother told me. A babysitter raped and murdered by some hicks running an Ozark chop shop," Henry thought with disgust. "And if she knew what they were up to, there had to be 100 others." "What was L.C. going to do with the girl after he finished with her?" Henry asked. "Leave her out here?" Nat shook his head. "Nah, especially not this close to the house." Henry felt his heart lurch at this bit of news. Elsie was going to pitch her in the hog pen after we was through. Nat Bivens' face turned sullen again. I was supposed to get a turn first. Henry felt his guts turn over, but he kept his voice level. How far is the house and who's there now? Hope it's close by and empty. Quarter mile, maybe a little more. No one's home right now. Aunt Char, she's gone to Cape till Monday. Uncle Dane, no tellin' when he'll get back. Henry didn't like the sound of this last comment, but said nothing about it. Where's the hog pen? Oh, it's 'fore you get to the house. Anybody know you're here? With what these four had planned, I doubt it, but who knows what these cretins were thinking. The Bivens boy shook his head. You gonna kill me? I ought to, Henry said lamely. He knew he would not. Don't move. Henry Bowman stood up and bolstered his smith. He fished in his pocket and pulled out the big two-bladed case knife and opened the larger of the two blades. Without taking his eyes off the prone figure of Nat Bivens, he reached over and slid the blade of the knife in between the log and the wire which bound Cammy Lynn's abdomen to it, then dug the tip of the blade in the wood and pulled on the handle. The soft iron wire made two popping noises as the keen blade parted it. Henry dropped to his knees and carefully sliced through the wire wrapped around the girl's wrists also. He looked at the twist binding the girl's neck to the log, then stabbed the knife into the side of the log, parting the wire as a cold chisel would. Time to cut out, he thought. Two more things first, though. Henry Bowman stowed his knife, then drew his gun and held it at the ready. Keep your face in the grass, just like you've been doing, he commanded. Nat Bivens did not move. Henry walked to where the boy's glasses had fallen, picked them up, and put them in the pocket with his knife. Then he stepped over to the crumpled corpse of L.C. Bivens and extracted the billfold from the hip pocket of Bivens' torn, blood-stained overalls. There was a large sheaf of bills in it, and Henry removed all but $80, glanced at the driver's license, wiped off his fingerprints, and replaced the wallet in the dead man's pocket. Stay where you are till you're sure I'm gone, Henry told the boy. Then get her some help. I'll be calling in, and if I find out she didn't make it, I'll come for you. You won't see it coming any more than you did this time. Get it? Nat Bivens snuffled, and Henry watched the back of the boy's head as he nodded his understanding. Don't bother looking for your glasses any more. I've got M. He gave a quick look around, made himself stare at Cammy Lynn's ravaged body, then jogged off into the woods. Came to a barbed wire fence half-mile back, Henry explained, throwing a thumb over his shoulder to emphasize the point. He had met up with David Webb about a mile from the site of the killings. Got no trespassing signs all over. Thought I'd find a decent place to shoot long range here, but no soap. Let's head back and try farther down the river. Suits me. You okay? You look kind of funny. I think I may be coming down with something stomach flu, maybe. That sucks. That's not all. My smith just broke the center pin inside the ejector rod, Henry lied. And like an idiot, I only brought one gun this trip. You can't shoot it at all? Not till I get back to my kit and take it apart to check it out. The two of them began hiking back towards the Gasconade. On the way, Henry had to stop and relieve his bladder. When he did, he slid Nat Bivens' glasses out of his pocket, wiped them off, and put them under a fallen tree limb lying on the ground. Can you fix it? David asked. Henry shook his head as he stared down at the disassembled in-frame revolver. Not here. It's nothing serious, but I didn't bring a spare center pin. First one of those I've ever broken. Must have had bad heat treat. Hope I don't get hit by a bolt of lightning for that blasphemy, Henry thought. He began to reassemble the revolver. So what do you want to do? We're on a canoe trip. Let's do some real canoeing. Let's see how far we can go before we get really hungry. Your arms are going to give out. Like hell they are, Henry answered with a forced grin. Your arms may be a little stronger from jerking off all the time, but don't think you got me beat on endurance. Hurry your ass up, Einstein, and we'll see who's got the endurance. Several times during the next 3 hours, Henry Bowman was close to telling his friend what had really happened. The event seemed too enormous to hold inside. Each time, however, he saw all kinds of future problems resulting, and he remembered a conversation he had overheard in Goodman's about a front-page murder case that was baffling the police. One of the customers, a county cop, had said something to Henry's Uncle Max that Henry had never forgotten. If it weren't for guys ratting each other out, only busts I'd have made in the last 10 years would be speeding tickets, and that's the goddamn truth, Max. That stuff in the books and movies is a bunch of crap. Guy works alone and keeps his mouth shut and doesn't do some dumb shit like cut off the dead guy's dick as a souvenir and stick it in the freezer where his girlfriend will find it and rat him out the next time she gets busted by an undercover for soliciting. 100 to 1 we two never catch him. And if by some fucking miracle we do turn the mutt up as a suspect and he still keeps his mouth shut, prosecution won't have enough to go to trial. And if the DA is an idiot and does take the case to a jury, and the guy still keeps his mouth shut and doesn't try to explain where he was and what he was doing and all that shit, you'll never get 12 people to convict. Never. When the two boys banked the canoe next, David Webb was none the wiser. It was almost dark, and David and Henry were both exhausted and famished. They were also 30 miles away from the site of the shooting. After the pair returned home, Henry Bowman watched the newspapers carefully for several weeks after the incident. He found no mention of any young men being shot to death in that area of Missouri. September 15th, 1968. Hello? Yes, this is Mr. Jackson at the library calling. May I speak to Cammy Lynn, please? It's about her library card. I feel like an idiot, Henry Bowman thought. It was his fourth call on the list of Lynn's in the local directory. He had a roll of quarters in front of him at the drugstore payphone. Just a minute, I'll get her. Henry's heart jumped. She's alive, he thought. Unless there are more than one. He heard an adult yell for the girl, and then the sound of another receiver being lifted. Hello? Yes, this is Mr. Jackson, Henry repeated, lowering his voice and feeling stupid. At the library? Is this Cammy Lynn? He was stalling for time, hoping the other person would hang up the other extension. Yes, the girl said. There was a questioning tone in her voice. She did not have a library card and in fact did not have any idea where the nearest library was located. Good. The reason I'm calling is... Henry stopped in mid-sentence when he heard the other extension click off. I'm not from the library, Henry said quickly. I called to see if you were all right. I met you when you were having some trouble last month. Henry heard a sharp intake of breath. Who are you? The girl whispered urgently. And why didn't you kill Nat Bivens? You let him get away, she said accusingly. I didn't have the stomach to murder him, Henry said with a hint of apology. Listen, I'm not going to call again. I just wanted to make sure you made it. I can't run too good yet. Have to see the doctor some more too. But thanks for killing the others. Mr. Dad said they needed it. You're welcome, Cammy, Henry replied. I think your father was right. Good luck, he added, then hung up the phone. He felt a sense of unreality about the conversation he'd just had. His spirits, though, were much higher than they'd been just a few minutes earlier. Henry Bowman had never been told of the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1968, that theory was not popular, if indeed anyone had thought of it at all. Thus, Henry Bowman had to discover on his own what the emotional aftermath of a killing was like, without being told by any experts what to expect. The experience with Cammy Lynn's attackers taught Henry Bowman two lessons that he would never forget. He learned that not only was it possible to kill someone and not be convicted, as the cop in the gun store had explained, but it was also possible to not ever be suspected of the killing in the first place. The second thing Henry learned was the same truth Irwin Mann had discovered over 20 years earlier. Killing someone was not an emotionally devastating experience when the person you killed was evil. Actually, when you got right down to it, Henry felt pretty good about the way things had worked out. November 2nd, 1968. You headed down to the foundry again? Catherine Bowman asked as Henry excused himself from the dinner table. You've been down there all weekend. Got more cutting and numbering to do, Mom, Henry said cheerfully. This thing's going to be a one-shot deal, assuming it's not a trap. You sure you don't need me to sign my name to these pieces of muffler pipe you're cutting up? Catherine Bowman joked. She found it most amusing that Henry was so adamant about how he was going to need her to become a gun dealer under these new laws that were coming. "No, I don't think so. Just don't get me thrown in jail, all right?" she said with a laugh. The idea that the federal government might arrest a middle-aged woman for agreeing to do this was, of course, utterly absurd. "I'll try not to," Henry Bowman said, then ran down the basement stairs to his late father's workshop to wear out some more hacksaw blades. Henry's well-focused vigor was understandable. One of the provisions of the 1968 Gun Control Act was that interstate commerce in all firearms was now going to be heavily restricted. Dealers were now going to have to be federally licensed and would not be able to sell to purchasers under the age of 18 for long guns and 21 for handguns. In conjunction with many other restrictions soon to go into effect under the 1968 Gun Control Act, the government was promising a 30-day amnesty where National Firearms Act weapons could be registered live without payment of the normal $200 tax. After the month was up, however, there would be no provision to register a weapon that was not in the system. Going one step further, non-functional weapons were soon to be registrable items under the 1968 Act. It would no longer be possible for a citizen to take the internal parts out of his Thompson to render it inoperable and expect to be left alone by the authorities. Given that many people thought the amnesty might be a trap, this set of circumstances posed a real dilemma to shooters like Henry Bowman, who had large numbers of non-taxed NFA weapons. If the amnesty was a trap, every gun he registered would be destroyed by the feds. If the amnesty was legitimate, then every gun he did not register would be one he wouldn't be able to take out and shoot again, for it would be contraband. Henry was fairly sure the amnesty was not an immediate trap, but there was another thing to consider. There were no guarantees as to what would happen in the future, and confiscation was always preceded by registration. Anyone with any knowledge of history knew this. Henry Bowman, because of the personal experiences of those in his family, was considerably better versed than most people on what governments were capable of doing when left unchecked. That was why, even if President Johnson himself had given him a document on presidential stationery that the amnesty registration was on the level, Henry Bowman was not about to submit all of his machine guns and cannons for governmental approbation. Henry Bowman had spent a lot of time thinking about what to do. Since the amnesty involved guns owned before the passage of the 1968 Act, it did not have an age minimum, and Henry therefore did not have to involve his mother in the registration process. In the end, he had settled on a plan of action that he thought covered all the eventualities in the best possible way. Henry had decided to register 6 machine guns: his 30-06 Colt Monitor, a 1918 a 2-bar, a 45 caliber 1928 Thompson, a 9mm S10, a 303 Bren, and a 30 caliber model 1917 belt-fed Browning water-cooled gun. These 6 machine guns were the ones he shot most, and if the amnesty was not a trap, these were the ones he wanted to be able to use every weekend and during the summer without problems. He had a second example of 5 of them held in reserve in case of confiscation. Henry did not have a duplicate monitor, but since he owned 2 other bar variants which used the same magazines, he felt he was covered. He had 23 other machine guns of various types that he did not shoot very often, and these he was not going to register either. In amending the National Firearms Act of 1934, the 1968 Act also reclassified military weapons with bores over a half-inch into a newly created destructive device category, which also required registration. Henry planned to register the 20mm Lati he had recently bought, and let the Solothurn S18-1000 his father had given him remain a free market weapon. Both guns fired the same ammo, and Henry made his choice based mainly on the fact that the Solothurn had a quick-change barrel, which meant it could be broken down without tools into manageable pieces for discreet storage, while the Lati was 9 feet long and would stay that way. What Henry had been working on the last few days involved the third area covered by the amnesty: firearm silencers. A $200 tax on a machine gun was very high, but a $200 tax levied on what was essentially a muffler for a lawnmower was ridiculous. Henry Bowman had only heard of one person in his life who had actually paid $200 to make his gun quieter. Virtually all registered silencers were owned by NFA dealers who paid $200 a year to deal in NFA weapons and who were thus exempted from the per-unit tariff. Henry fully intended to become an NFA dealer, but he knew he had to wait until his 21st birthday. He had already checked up on that. The amnesty was going to allow registration of silencers without having to pay the tax during the 1-month window. That was why Henry was spending a great deal of time cutting and putting serial numbers on various diameters and lengths of stainless steel aircraft tubing. He had decided that 50 would probably suffice for a lifetime supply, given his high-volume shooting habits. The outer tubes were what was important. He could make the internals up later as they were needed. Stainless steel was a lot harder to cut than mild steel, and Henry was soon sweating again. Christ, Henry said to himself, cutting off pieces of aircraft tubing and stamping numbers on them all weekend, because it's the only time when you don't have to pay the feds $200 for each one. His hands began to sweat, so he gripped the saw more tightly to compensate. Is this a joke or what? Henry thought for perhaps the 100th time as he drew the saw back and forth and watched the blade slowly make its way through the 2-inch seamless tubing.
February 8,
1969. Hey, get your own French fries. Jesus, Bowman, don't have a cow. I was only taking one. Well, take one from somebody else, Kurth, if you're too cheap to cough up a quarter and buy your own. Keep your damn French fries. They're no good here anyway. Jimmy Kurth was a notorious mooch, but it was mainly an act. He was absolutely fearless when it came to talking to girls, and because of that, his friends overlooked his minor shortcomings. Don't whine at me, Henry said. I told you we should have gone to Steak and Shake, but you guys aren't happy unless the cooks salt the piss out of everything, and you get to eat off of cardboard instead of china. Very funny, asshole. Hey, Henry, Bill Pressler called from one of the other booths. Come here a minute, need your help on something. Henry Bowman shoved the last of the salty French fries into his mouth and slid off the vinyl-covered bench seat. What's up? Sit down. Here, want some fries? I'm full. Wonder what he wants, and I wonder who this older guy with him is. Dick, this is Henry Bowman, the guy I was telling you maybe could help you out. Dick Gaines, the older boy said, looking a little uncomfortable as he shook Henry's hand across the Formica tabletop. Henry could tell Gaines was embarrassed about something. Bill Pressler took charge of the situation. Dick goes to school with my brother Gordon at Hilldale. Which means that Dick is probably a dumb shit, Henry thought to himself. Dick's got the SAT coming up, Bill went on, and he doesn't do so good on tests. Now it's been confirmed, Henry said silently as he put a concerned expression on his face and nodded for his friend to continue. I told him he ought to talk to you. Can you help me out? Gaines asked, feeling embarrassed at the entire situation, and especially the fact that this new kid was younger than he. Bill says you took it a year early and aced it. Henry shook his head. Look, I don't think I can help on something like that, especially since it's in 2 weeks? Richard Gaines broke in quickly. Oh, that's no problem. I can get all the stuff made up in 3 days. 5 tops. What on earth is he talking about? Henry wondered at this odd assertion. Well, even if you can, the SAT isn't something you can really cram for. You can try to learn vocabulary for the English part, and that'll help some, but 2 weeks isn't much time. He took a deep breath and went on. The math section? Well, either you can do arithmetic or you can't. I don't think I can teach you the math part in 2 weeks if you're really weak there. Now, what I can do, Henry said, warming to the subject, is teach you to see the way the test writers think, which is a big part of being able to get all the way through the test before time is called. And something that anyone with half a brain can see after reading the first 2 or 3 questions he wanted to add. The most important thing is, No, you're missing the point, Bill Pressler broke in. Dick doesn't want a tutor. That's not going to be enough, especially not now, with 2 weeks left, like you said. Then, how can I help him out? Take the test for me. Henry's mouth opened as he stared at Dick Gaines. He was dumbfounded. Gaines went on quickly. That's all you've got to do. Walk into the center, show the right ID, sit down and take the test for me. You remember what it was like, a whole bunch of kids you didn't know showing up at a place you'd never been before. A couple hours easy work and you'll be out of there, right? Henry didn't know what to say. Getting a ringer to take the SAT for you. Jesus, who is this guy, he thought. Ought to call himself Dickhead Gaines. Despite this reaction, Henry's mind instinctively went to analyzing the obstacles to pulling off such a plan. Well, the main problem would be the ID. When I took it last year, I wasn't 16 yet, so I used a copy of my birth certificate. Everyone else had a driver's license, though, and I think if someone who was supposed to be 17 or 18 like you tried to say he couldn't drive a car, they'd look real close at him. Hey, I said, that's no problem. I can get a real driver's license for you, not a fake one. Your picture on it, my name, address, and birth date. Henry thought about that for a moment. Yeah, sure, I go into the license bureau, say I'm you and lost my license, they look up your address, take a new picture, and mail you off the new license. Since we're under 21, it can't be a liquor scam, and high school kids don't have any other ID anyway, so what are they going to ask for as proof a note from your mother? Guys must pull that trick all the time for their underage brothers, sometimes even for friends if they really trust them. Except I'm 4 inches shorter than you are, and you got blonde hair. They're sure to spot that. And even if they didn't, we still wouldn't get the thing in 2 weeks. Not even if we went for the picture tomorrow. Why the hell am I even talking about this stupid idea, Henry asked himself. Gaines was impressed at how quickly Henry had realized how to get a real driver's license issued with someone else's picture on it. You'd be right about the clerk spotting the different description and the time it would take, he said with a broad smile. Except for one thing. My dad owns the license office. I can fill out the forms myself, stamp his signature on it, and tell him I need immediate turnaround. 5 days tops. Richard Gaines looked very smug. Henry frowned. How can your dad own a driver's license office? He immediately demanded. Those are state offices. Missouri state government owns and operates them. Henry was thinking about all the times he had gone with his father and waited while surly workers had taken their time waiting on them. The first time he had gone by himself to license his '64 Chevy 2 Supersport, the delay had been even worse. Dick Gaines was almost laughing now and shaking his head happily. No, my dad owns one. The state owns the land and the building, but he owns the business. He gets the money from license fees. I can do all the paperwork for the new driver's license tonight. Henry Bowman ignored this last comment. He wanted to know more about this license office setup. So, if the state owns the land and the building, how does somebody get to own a driver's license office? He asked. The governor appoints him, Richard Gaines said proudly. So that's it, Henry thought. Another damn political scam. Fits right in with our new Missouri vehicle inspection law, where you get to hang around a gas station for 2 hours, waiting for a gangly kid with bad skin to take your money so he can tell you that your horn, turn signals, and brakes are working. His thoughts returned to the license office. Wonder what the governor got out of this asshole's dad for that little gold mine. More than a pardon? Most Missourians and everyone with politicians or newsmen in their families knew that Democratic governors in Missouri sold pardons. Trial lawyers found this practice especially irritating when the governor charged less than they did, as was the case currently, but there was little they could do about it. Yeah, my dad's good friends with the governor, Gaines lied. This guy talks too damn much, Henry thought. He had no intention of taking the SAT for anyone, but there was no way he would ever do it for Dick Gaines. Look, I have to tell you, I'm not wild about this idea. There may not be much chance of getting caught, but if something happened and I did, I'd be up shit creek. So would I, Gaines said immediately. Henry snorted. Yeah, but you're fucked right now. Your grades are lousy and you're going to bomb on the one test every college uses to level out the applicants from different schools. You gotta take some risk. I don't. In fact, I don't need this shit at all. Richard Gaines was used to being talked to this way from his father, but not from someone he barely knew and who was 2 years his junior. He didn't like it at all, and he wanted to get up and leave, but he was desperate. Look, I know that. Hey, I came to you, right? Listen, we can work something out. I'd be willing to pay you. Oh, did you originally hope to find someone who'd do it as a favor? Henry thought sarcastically. But I'm not going to pay someone unless I know he's going to come through. Trying to take control of this conversation, are we? That's not a problem, Henry said easily. I'm very performance-oriented. I'll guarantee you at least 1,500 combined score. That also means each will be over 700. The math will probably be higher than the verbal. Henry's mind was working quickly to come up with terms that would be impossible for Gaines to agree to. F-1500? Like a... Here he thought for a few moments. A 750 on both? No one in Richard Gaines High School had ever earned scores anywhere near that high. Yes. Or 715, 785, or whatever. 1,500 combines the minimum. Any less, you get $200. Huh? Gaines said. Henry's last comment had made no sense to him. Soon as we agree to do this, I go to the bank and get a cashier's check payable to you for $200 and put it in an envelope with your money, Henry explained. A lawyer holds the envelope and can't release it unless we're both there. When the test scores come back, we go see him. 1,500 or higher, you tell him to give it to me. If I pull, say, 750, 730, then I tell him to hand it to you. Richard Gaines was adjusting to the concept that he might make $200 while having 700 plus scores credited to him when he realized that Henry had not yet stated his fee. How much does my check have to be for? He said finally. $2 a point based on the minimum, $3,000. Have a cashier's check for it by 6 o'clock Monday night. If that's too much or too soon, get someone else. $3,000, Richard Gaines yelled. Several tables of the people in nearby booths turned to look at him. Are you out of your fucking mind? He added in an intense whisper. When Bill Pressler had offered to introduce him to Henry Bowman, Gaines had hoped he could talk the kid into taking the test for a $20 bill. Not at all, Henry said amiably. Do you know what I could buy with $3,000? Gaines continued in a slightly more measured tone. You bet I do, Henry thought immediately. You could buy a clean clip-wing Cub stressed for aerobatics just like mine. Or you could buy a 3-year-old 427 Corvette and a Korean War power wagon with a ring mount. Or maybe Interamco's entire inventory of 20mm Solothurn ammo. $3,000's pretty cheap, considering what 4 years at a good college costs, Henry explained. And I have to risk ending up where you are right now. You, on the other hand... He finished the sentence with a shrug. Sat makes the difference, and you know it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have come looking for me. Henry saw the older boy's expression change and realized with astonishment that Gaines was thinking about what he had said. Jesus, he's buying this crap, Henry thought in disbelief. Before 6 Monday, Henry said as he slid out of the booth and stood to leave. Bill here can give you my phone number so I can tell you where the lawyer's office is. Since if you asked me now, I wouldn't have the faintest idea of what lawyer would want to hold an envelope for a couple of high school kids. Let me know, one way or the other. He walked out the door, waving goodbye to Jimmy Keith as he went out the door. Henry was grinning as he stepped into the parking lot. He was remembering the look on Gaines' face when he had named his fee. Couldn't have pulled a needle out of his ass with a tractor. Max Collins used the phrase occasionally. Henry thought it was very appropriate. Well, after that little talk, there ought to be some good gossip around school Monday, Henry told himself with a smile. As it turned out, there wasn't. What would happen on Monday would be much more interesting.